Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Awop Bop Aloo Mop, Little Richard, A Life of Sex, Drugs, Rock and Roll, and Religion. By Tina Andrews. Read by Sean Crisden. Publisher's note. In this audio edition, you may hear references to visual elements present in the print and ebook formats of the book. And there appeared a great wonder in the sky. Revelation, chapter 12, verse 1. I saw a great flash of light in the sky. I took it as a sign I gotta sing God's music. Little Richard. Introduction. When you're dead and there's dirt on your grave, then they'll say how great you were, but you'll never get to hear it. It's black music. Why won't they just say it? If it's pork, say it comes from the pig. If it's beef, say it comes from the cow. If it's rock and roll, say it comes from black people. Little Richard, 1999. True story. I was 4 years old when Little Richard's Tutti Frutti hit the airwaves in 1955. My parents played that 45 record so much on their little handheld record player, they went through 2 copies of the song and 2 needles had to be replaced. My mom and dad could really dance. They tore it up to that record, and I loved watching them. I was told that because I heard the song so often, I could be seen dancing in the long hallway of our Prairie Avenue Southside apartment in Chicago, singing, Awop Bop Aloo Mop, Alop Bang Bang. Okay, so those weren't the exact words, but you catch the drift. And the drift was that rock and roll transformed American culture more profoundly than any other art form. Yet to understand that art form, you must accept and appreciate its roots, for they are deeply embedded in black culture. Coming out of rhythm and blues, which itself came out of gospel, blues music was created by black slaves who adapted their African musical heritage to the American environment in which they sadly found themselves. Taking many forms and undergoing many permutations throughout the years, blues formed the basis of jazz, rhythm and blues, and ultimately, rock and roll. Torn from their kin, enduring a brutal journey from their beloved homes in West Africa to the American South on slave ships, Africans were forced into a servile way of life. They tried to retain some continuity with their past in a variety of ways, including music. Their voices glided between the more rigid European musical scale to create a distinctive new sound. One observer wrote in 1845, Our black oarsmen made the woods echo to their songs. One of them, taking the lead, improvised a verse, then others joined in the chorus, always repeating the same words. Some slaves, especially those from the Bantu tribe, whooped or jumped octaves during the call and response, which served as a basis for field hollers. Slaves, accustomed to dancing and singing to the beat of drums in Africa, emphasized rhythm in their music. In a single song, they clapped, danced, and slapped their bodies in myriad different rhythms, compensating for the absence of drums, which were outlawed by plantation owners. These owners feared that the instrument would be used to coordinate slave insurrections. One ex-slave, writing in 1853, called the rhythmic practice patting juba. It was performed by striking the right shoulder with one hand, all the while keeping time with the feet and singing. African Americans used these African musical traits in their religious ceremonies. One writer in The Nation described a praise meeting held in 1867. At regular intervals, one hears an elder wailing a hymn sung 2 lines at a time, and whose wailing cadences into the night air are indescribably melancholy. The subsequent response from the congregation to the bluesy call of the elder, along with the accompanying instruments, created the call and response, the rhythmic complexity, and the minor key sound common in African music. Such African-inspired church music, later known as spirituals, became the basis for the blues, when singers applied the religious music to secular themes. In the early 50s, Richard Wayne Penniman applied these musical principles, sped up the beat, changed the keys from minor to major, and created this new musical genre that everyone worldwide began to embrace: rock and roll. The art form incorporated teen angst and the emotions exploding from the lives that informed it. It reflected its surroundings, for example, the need to escape, be free, and to let off steam. No one had more of an impact on all of it than Little Richard. Richard Penniman burst onto the American scene in 1955 with Tutti Frutti, and almost by himself poured the concrete to cement the anti-rules for this exciting new music. Dubbing himself the architect of rock and roll, he had the biggest influence on musicians and singers, black and white, with his wild performances which included standing up, playing piano, sometimes with a foot up on the keyboard, jumping onto the piano and dancing, and wearing outrageous androgynous costuming, including sequined tuxedos, glittered shoes, and velvet capes, coupled with pancake makeup, eyeliner, and a foot-high pompadour hairdo. He was a scandalous thing to behold. Flash forward. I finally got to meet Little Richard in 1998 on the set of my first produced film as a screenwriter, Warner Brothers' Why Do Fools Fall in Love, directed by Gregory Nava, Selena. The film chronicled the life of 1950s teenage sensation Frankie Lyman, who died of a drug overdose at age 25. In it, Little Richard played himself in the courtroom scenes for a lawsuit brought against Morris Levy and Roulette Records for royalties owed the Frankie Lyman estate. Later in the film, Richard performed Keep a Knockin' and was sensational. Because Richard had brought on a similar lawsuit with his former label, Specialty Records, and its owner, Art Rupe, I wanted the real Little Richard to appear in the film to lend gravitas. He and I spent many hours in his dressing room, chatting about show business, rock and roll, and his role in it. He was a fountain of anecdotes and information. Since he knew Frankie, I had to ask him how it felt to lose the young star to heroin addiction the same year as Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy. Since Richard was battling his own addiction in those days, I wondered if Frankie's death portended a future that could have been Richard's own. Using one of his favorite phrases, he answered, "It shook my mind." Well, Little Richard shook mine. I knew that at some point I would have to tell his story, and have been astonished it has taken so long to shine a light on the man who had such a huge impact in the creation of rock and roll and the stage personas of so many performers in it. Yes, Ma Rainey and Chuck Berry deserve credit also to some musical purists, but Little Richard and his music can be heard in the sounds and performances of countless legends, and everyone we enjoy or have enjoyed, from Mick Jagger to Michael Jackson to Prince, the Rolling Stones, Paul McCartney, the Beatles, Elvis Presley, James Brown, Jerry Lee Lewis, David Bowie, Lady Gaga, and Keith Richards, who all cite Richard as their inspiration. The list is endless. Rolling Stones frontman Mick Jagger tells of watching Little Richard perform and being inspired to not only sing and dance, but sing and dance like that. He and Keith Richards were profoundly influenced by Little Richard, and Jagger cites him as his introduction to R&B music. Nobody could beat Little Richard's stage act. Little Richard is the originator and my first idol. When Keith Richards heard Tutti Frutti for the first time, he recalls, "It was as though the world changed suddenly from monochrome to technicolor." Richard was an early vocal influence on Rod Stewart, who said, "I remember trying to sound like Little Richard." David Bowie called Little Richard his inspiration, stating that upon listening to Tutti Frutti that he heard God. Then there is Bob Dylan, who, when leaving school in 1959, wrote in his high school yearbook under Ambition to join Little Richard. After opening for Richard with his band Bluesology, pianist Reginald Dwight became enthused. Later changing his name to Elton John, he said, "When I saw Little Richard standing on top of the piano, all the stage lights, sequins, and energy, I decided then and there that I wanted to be a rock and roll piano player." Several members of the Beatles, featured in Chapter 10, were also heavily influenced by Richard, including Paul McCartney and George Harrison. McCartney idolized him in school and later used his recordings as inspiration for his up-tempo rockers such as I'm Down. In fact, Long Tall Sally was the first song McCartney performed in public. And it continued well into the 80s and 90s. Trust me, there would be no Rick James, Prince, Morris Day, or Michael Jackson without Little Richard. Prince has said that his androgynous look, music, and vocal style were owed to Little Richard, whose protege, Jimi Hendrix, once a band member, would later say, "I wanted to do with my guitar what Richard did with his voice." Farrokh Balsara performed many covers of Little Richard's songs as a teenager before finding fame as Freddie Mercury, the lead singer for Queen. Even more contemporary performers like Mystical, Andre 3000, Benjamin of Outkast, and Bruno Mars were cited by critics as having emulated Little Richard's style in their own works. Mystical's vocal rap delivery was compared to Richard's. Andre 3000's vocals in Outkast's hit Hey Ya were compared to an indie rock Little Richard. Bruno Mars has admitted Little Richard was one of his earliest influences. Mars's song Runaway Baby from his album Doo-Wops and Hooligans was cited by the New York Times as channeling Little Richard. On songs like Tutti Frutti and Lucille, Richard sounded like an exorcist priest wrestling the devil out of a possessed man. His falsetto screeches eviscerated the rules of pop singing. His was a voice that leapt from a transistor radio and left singe marks on a generation of performers. Additionally, Little Richard altered the consensus in America and the world that blacks could only do one kind of music, race music. 1950s rock and roll music, pioneered by black musicians, was racially inclusive and attracted listeners and performers reaching across the color line. The contemporary view of rock as music made by white people for white people is short-sighted and, frankly, inaccurate. For me, an African-American fan of rock who is accustomed to and tired of the view that rock is music in which black people are not supposed to participate, it became important to write a full-on sketch of the one performer who represents not only the origins of the genre, but the music rendered by a black man, and a black queer man at that. Somehow, the music Little Richard created was co-opted by whites and became a musical genre called simply rock music, in which suddenly black people were rendered inauthentic who performed it. By the time Jimi Hendrix, featured in Chapter 13, died in 1970, and later when Lenny Kravitz rose to prominence, the idea of a black man playing lead guitar in a rock band or singing lead as a rock and roller like Elvis seemed bizarre. The standard narrative became that white rock musicians were guided by an individual creative vision, whereas black musicians were considered authentic only when they stayed true to black traditions. Serious rock became white because only white musicians could be original without accusations of racial betrayal. By the 1980s, rock music produced and performed by African Americans was no longer considered authentically black, not to audiences and in particular within the music industry. The prevailing sentiment was that neither black audiences, white audiences, nor black musicians had any interest in black rock. So when, and more importantly, why did rock and roll become white music when its roots are so steeped in black culture? And how did it affect Little Richard, the African-American progenitor of the genre who was still performing it? There is a short story by Alice Walker called 1955, where a man named Trainer, who is the king of rock and roll, tells the protagonist, Gracie May Still, an older black songwriter from whom he has bought songs cheaply over the years which she had recorded. Trainer made the songs into hits by re-recording them as white bread covers. Says Trainer to Gracie, "They want what you got, but they don't want you. They want what I got, only it ain't mine. That's what makes them so hungry for me when I sing. They gettin' the flavor of something, but they ain't getting the thing itself. They like a pack of hound dogs trying to gobble up a scent." Yes, it is a thinly veiled rendering of Elvis Presley and Willie Mae Big Mama Thornton, the black woman who wrote and sang Hound Dog. But more importantly, it completely defines the dilemma all too many songwriters and singers of color experienced in those days as their works were bought on the cheap or co-opted and repackaged for white audiences, but were not given their proper credit or financial due for having created the music. It illustrates the reality of a business that was compelled to, as writer Charles Shaar Murray wrote, separate black music, which by and large white Americans love, from black people, who by and large white Americans don't. Yes, Little Richard was angered by what the music power structure did to him in his day, but he didn't simmer in silence. Not then, not now. He demanded fairer treatment, but in the end he believed that racism robbed him of his musical legacy. During a 1999 interview with the Washington Post, Richard still touted himself as the architect of rock and roll. He said, "I put blues and boogie-woogie together and made rock and roll. I'm the architect of rock and roll. I created it. It's just rhythm and blues up-tempo. It's just that old blues beat speeded up with more bottom on it. It's black music, but they won't admit it. They won't give us credit. If it's a white guy, they say he's the king of rock and roll. But if it's a black guy, they add self-proclaimed. They say he's the self-proclaimed king of rock and roll. Well, if it's pork, say it comes from the pig. If it's beef, say it comes from the cow. If it's rock and roll, say it comes from black people." Preach, brother. Sitting before Paul McCartney on stage at the 1988 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction ceremony of the Beatles, Richard said it almost made him cry not to be acknowledged by Paul, who had often blatantly mimicked him on so many Beatles records. Later, Paul was exonerated by George Harrison, who pointed to Little Richard and said, "Thank you all very much, especially the rock and rollers. And Little Richard there, if it wasn't for," gesturing to Richard, "it was all his fault, really." 2 decades earlier, Little Richard stood alone amongst the most influential rock and roll performers whose audiences were primarily young white kids. His influence on musicians of his time was unparalleled, and these artists were some of the giants in the industry. But what about Little Richard himself? Just who was this mastermind who created rock and roll? What made him tick? What lay beneath the makeup, capes, costumes, and outrageousness? In my quest to delve inside the psyche and genesis of his music, persona, and Southern Baptist roots, I discovered a reality. Behind Little Richard's flamboyance and incredible onstage presence, which has been lovingly borrowed by so many, there was an epic, ongoing personal battle, one he struggled with all throughout his career, his complicated relationship with his sexual orientation and its effect on his Christian faith. 6 times in his life, Richard left secular music to lift his voice for the Lord, in an effort to suppress his homosexuality. In an interview on the Christian-oriented Three Angels Broadcasting Network in 2017, Little Richard reiterated his belief that homosexuality was unnatural, while reaffirming his strong Christian faith that had followed him for most of his life. God made men, and women. Women, you've got to live the way God wants you to live. He can save you. But a year later, he was back on stage, strutting his stuff, shaking his ass, singing Tutti Frutti, a song originating as a testament to homosexuality. A writer who once sat face-to-face with Little Richard found his thoughts turning to the things Richard's eyes have seen in his life. Images, he was told, were church congregations observing Richard preaching in a way that led one worshiper to describe Richard as the most Christ-like figure I have ever met. A friend of Richard's leading a naked man around a dressing room by a penis so long that it looked like a tow rope. A low-flying Soviet satellite, which persuaded the singer Armageddon was imminent, so he must quit performing. And countless orgies, distinguished by degrees of athleticism, stamina, and ingenuity, so remarkable that, if Richard's own memory is to be trusted, they might have shocked the Marquis de Sade. "I remember one night," said Richard to his first biographer, Charles White, "we had this wonderful orgy going, one of the best I have ever been to, and in the middle of it, somebody knocked on my door. I said, 'Just a moment, this is an orgy.'" Little Richard has long publicly fought a battle between his faith and sexuality, but something about this man, who, as of this writing, has not walked in years due to a bad hip, made me feel like this battle may finally be over. These days, there is no eyeliner, makeup, or wigs. the high energy of the performer is absent. But neither God nor Little Richard won. The violence he went through as a child, and the rigid laws and attitudes surrounding sexuality and gender we socialize people into accepting, is the victor. And this is far too often our black male musical icon's narrative. Most black people are born into an Abrahamic religion, but very often artistic inquisitiveness contradicts the laws of that religion. But artistic expression must be articulated. That articulation, in this case, was rock and roll, expressed through the art of a queer black man, an aesthetic that shifted how we see our stars, gay or straight. It's David Bowie in sequins and full makeup. It's Michael Jackson with sequined socks, gloves, and fedora. It's Freddie Mercury in capes and crowns, Elton John in huge sunglasses and platform shoes, Lady Gaga in meat dresses, and Prince in, well, anything. These stars and their expressions freed young white people, generation after generation, but imprisoned Little Richard inside of his own black guilt, because he had a deep-rooted belief that his gayness, thus his music, was against God, who gave him his talent in the first place. It is sad to think that the people who created the grunge movement in the 70s, rap in the 80s, hip-hop in the 90s, or Afropunk music fests in the 2000s have not all been able to receive the same type of societal freedom for their differentness. In the case of Little Richard, what we have now is a man who designed a magnificent art form that made us happy. It made me, as a young girl who would go on to have her own creative expression, sing and dance up and down the hall as a kid. But then Richard restrained himself with religion when he should have enhanced and exalted himself with it. God gave him a larger-than-life gift, one very few of us would have dismissed or written off to the devil. For a man of God, now older, wiser, and a recluse, Little Richard's experiences, decisions, and memories, many gleaned from his extraordinary career and various interviews, reveal a journey fraught with indecision, confusion, and epic, candid confrontations between his outer affectations and his inner demons. That legendary career incorporates a remarkable life spent in the parallel universes of the sacred, the secular, and the sexual. And it is a story that must be told. Tina Andrews, New York City, 2020. Prologue. The Event. It was October 9th, 1985. The tour in Britain had been grueling. Little Richard had just recorded his first all-new album in 8 years, Lifetime Friends, that seemed to merge the two disparate forces in his life, flagrant rock and roll exhibitionism and sacred Christian morality, both of which resulted from his dueling roles as a gay show business performer and an evangelist, gospel singer/preacher. After completing work on the album in London, things were not helped by an 11-hour flight back to Los Angeles on October 8, 1985, followed by 12 hours filming on the set of NBC's hit television drama Miami Vice, where he had just wrapped playing the character of Reverend Marvell Quinn, a minister preaching the gospel against drug abuse beachside in Miami. The episode, titled Where the Buses Don't Run, would be broadcast in the series' second season. Richard was exhausted. He was in the middle of a stunning Hollywood comeback, and so many people were cheering on his success. In addition to recording the album, he had made a music video, recently filmed the movie Down and Out in Beverly Hills, where he sang his hit Great Gosh Almighty, and made guest appearances on The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson, and The Hollywood Squares. On top of this, he had been chosen by the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as one of their first ever inductees, and he was planning another world tour. All Richard wanted now was some sleep. Driving back from the set sometime after midnight on Santa Monica Boulevard's Route 66, on his way to the hotel where he was living, Richard fell asleep at the wheel of his Nissan 300ZX, traveling 60 miles per hour. He lost control of the car, and in one spectacular display of unexpected bad luck, smashed into a telephone pole on Crisden Avenue. The impact nearly killed him. Firefighters and paramedics came, and it took over an hour for them to cut the living legend from the wreckage with the jaws of life. Richard, 52 years old at the time, was unconscious, pinned between the steering wheel and front seat. He was so seriously injured he should have died, given the severity of the crash. His right leg had to be reconstructed as it was fractured in 8 places, and the singer also suffered a punctured bladder, broken ribs, and head and facial injuries. The accident prevented him from being able to attend the inaugural Rock and Roll Hall of Fame ceremony on January 23, 1986, where he was among the first group of 10 to ever be inducted in the new organization and appear on its first televised show. When he was finally able, Little Richard had to send a videotaped message to his fans in acceptance of his induction, since, sadly, it would take the singer another 6 months to recover. But for Richard, it was enough time to take stock of his existence, to contemplate his career and the duality of his life's purpose, to reflect on his journey from Macon, Georgia, as a teenage boy who sang gospel in church while struggling with feelings of same-sex attraction, who went on to become one of the biggest stars in the world, forever known as the architect of rock and roll. As he wandered in and out of consciousness, his soul was in an untethered, spectral state of am I alive or should I just die purgatory. He had the time to remember and deconstruct that young boy, that black kid growing up in segregated Georgia who was so eager to succeed through an insurmountable quantity of obstacles, emotional, regretful, external, internal, and spiritual. Side A. Sex, drugs, rock and roll. My inspiration for singing was Mahalia Jackson. She sang with so much feeling. She was so sincere. She inspired me quite a bit. When you hear my show in person, if you listen closely, you can hear her in me. My phrasing is different because I was singing rock and roll, but I used how she put feeling in a song, how she would lose herself in a song. Little Richard. 1. Macon, Georgia. God, sin, and music, that's what I was born into, said Little Richard, who began singing in his local church choir while still a youngster, because musical tastes in his household were limited. Richard recalled he came from a family where my people didn't like rhythm and blues. It was either Bing Crosby's Pennies from Heaven or Ella Fitzgerald. That's all I heard. But Little Richard was also born into a world defined by a larger separatism, a world divided by blackness and whiteness. The two-ness, as W.E.B. Du Bois wrote in The Souls of Black Folk, in which it was impossible to avoid this sense of always looking at one's self through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a predominantly white society that looks on in amused contempt and pity. And yet it was also a world, as Du Bois determined, which was so rich, vibrant, and colorful that giving in to its own devices created a culture that defined a sector of the American artistic mainstream. This sector encompassed a community of artists in which imagination and self-invention could triumph over pedigree, and in which, as James Baldwin wrote in The Fire Next Time, there existed a zest and a joy and a capacity for facing and surviving disaster. Perhaps we were, all of us, pimps, whores, racketeers, church members, and children, bound together by the nature of our oppression, the specific and peculiar complex of risks we had to run. This complex of risks, coupled with that imagination and self-invention, were born into Richard Wayne Penniman, as given to him by the Creator of all things. Raised in Macon, Georgia, the third of the 12 children born to Leva Mae and Charles Bud Penniman, Richard arrived on the scene on December 5, 1932. His father, a church deacon, was a stern disciplinarian who also owned a nightclub called the Tip-In Inn and sold moonshine as a bootlegger on the side when Prohibition ruled. From an early age, he showed interest in music, singing and playing the piano in his local church, absorbing the blues and gospel music of his deep Southern heritage. Though Richard grew up dirt poor, he also grew up in a variety of Christian denominations, all of them.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?